3 years from now is double that time period. I mean, that's a forever from now in terms of NIL time.
We haven't even talked about Dylan Raiola.
And I was actually going to bring that up. I was actually going to. That's exactly where I was going. I mean, obviously he comes from some money because Dad did quite well in the National Football League. But does NIL mean, because you spent some time with him, does NIL money mean a lot to Dylan Raiola?
You know what's funny is like when and maybe this is like my business and how it needs to change, because if you're in the NFL and you cover it, you know, the NFL Network or you know any media outlets. It's a part of the conversation when you talk to players when they're free agents, which is essentially what these high school juniors and seniors are. What's it going to take? You know, where do you want to go? How much? You know, how big of a contract are you going to need? Well, those conversations don't really come up. Like I didn't talk to Dylan Raiola about how many millions he might need to sway him from one school to another, and it just. You know, I didn't talk to Dominic Raiola about that. And I think with them, it is slightly different because, as you said, his dad's got an NFL pension and they made pretty good money in the NFL. And they have the ability to move around and go on visits wherever they want to go on visits on any weekend on short notice. But for the vast majority of the players in his position, who are these 5-star or 4-star kids, they couldn't be more different than him. So for them, absolutely, it's at top of mind. I think Dylan Raiola can think big picture. You know, kind of like Arch Manning a year ago. There's more in common with those two than people want to consider, want to give them credit for. I mean, obviously, Dylan Raiola doesn't come from the first family of NFL quarterbacks. But, you know, he's got some pretty good NFL quarterbacks in his corner, the guys who his dad snapped the ball to with the Detroit Lions. You know, Matthew Stafford at the top of the list. He can think big picture. He can play the long game and go, okay, I want to go to the place that's going to be able to get me the best spot in the NFL. And if I'm a first-round pick, I'm going to make more money than I would ever make in NIL. I don't care if, you know, you actually collect on the Jaden Rashada contract. You're still going to make more money in your first contract and certainly your second contract in the NFL than you could ever imagine playing the NIL game. So, I think Arch Manning is going about it that way. I think Dylan Raiola is going about it that way. No, don't get me wrong. It's still going to take something. They're going to have to pony up from a collective standpoint at Nebraska or USC or wherever to get Dylan Raiola to come to school just because he's the number one player in the country. And that's, you know, you'd be silly to turn down the money if you're him. But, not to the same – I don't think it's going to be the same kind of circus that it was with Rashada or some of these other guys in the class of 2023.
What's your feeling on Raiola?
I think Nebraska's in a good spot. We saw him come in on a weekend in February when it was a dead period and the coaches were prohibited from talking to him. You know, he could see his uncle, Donovan, the offensive line coach. They have a pre-existing relationship that's pretty hard to argue against, and so he could stay at Donnie's house and they could work out. They could talk about whatever, but no meetings. No meetings by Rule with Matt Rule or with Marcus Satterfield, the offensive coordinator. The thing about that weekend that stood out to me, and I think this should really be taken into account when you try to read the tea leaves here, is that he went to that basketball game. He went down and sat courtside. And put himself on display, knew what was going to happen. Certainly his family knew what was going to happen when he went down there and threw the bones to the student section, made everybody happy. I know the passion that Dominic has for Nebraska, and I don't think that he would put Nebraska through that kind of misery of having that carrot out there and then losing out on him, unless they all felt like there was a pretty decent chance he was going to end up in Lincoln. So not to say that it's a done deal, but he's going to come back at the end of the first week of spring practice. So real quick here.
He already had once committed to Ohio State. When does he want to give his next commitment?
It depends on who you ask. It depends on who you talk to. He's not really himself letting that be known. And
he doesn't have to, because it's not like somebody's going to close something off for him, right? He's the type of kid that, it'll stay open until
he's the kind of prospect that can take it up till signing.
Yeah.
Would he want to make a commitment again if there's any chance he changes his mind.
Well, I mean, in that
I mean,
case,
does he want to do that whole commit decommit thing all over?
he doesn't. And I think they really learned from that situation at Ohio State, and it was premature, and they didn't go through the whole process. It was like they were at the start of the recruiting process with Ohio State. They felt good about everything that was going on, but they didn't do enough to vet the whole thing to know that it was the right fit. And that's like the very, watered down generic version of everything that happened there. But look, you can never be sure. Like he could always have reason to wait a little bit longer. As it pertains to Nebraska, he could always say, man, I want to see how they do when they get into the season in September. I want to see how that Minnesota game goes, how that Colorado game goes. And then if you're unsure after that, well, I want to see how they do when they get into the Big Ten. And you could be in November, and sure, he could still wait. But I think what's more important about his recruiting, especially for Nebraska, now if he commits to Georgia, it doesn't matter. Like, they're going to sign a great class. If he commits to USC, they're probably going to sign a pretty damn good class around him no matter what. But he can shape the Nebraska class, and he wants to be with great players. That's going to help him. It's going to help him get to the NFL. If he's got a couple of 4- and 5-star wide receivers out there in his class, and he's got a great tight end, and he's got good offensive linemen. So if it's Nebraska, and he commits, say, in April, well, then there's all kinds of time for Nebraska to build a class around him. And it's going to undeniably sign a much better group of recruits in 2024 if he's committed in April than it would if he commits in November.